This series on the Sasquatch was narrated and produced by Susan Lumsden with the assistance of Elizabeth James. Technical direction by Michel Depassier in Montreal for Radio-Canada International.
The Smithsonian Institute gave us the runaround, and Yerkes Regional Primate Institute in Atlanta, Georgia gave us the runaround. And plus, there's others who are in other scientific fields and hold doctorates who have seen things, and they are afraid to come forth because of the murmurings of their fellow scientific body, you know, etc. And quite frankly, I have found that American scientific community just doesn't seem to care, and that's putting it mildly.
Sasquatch, the anthropology of the unknown. The Psychology of Sasquatch is the fourth of 5 programs based on a rather unusual conference on humanoid monsters held at the University of British Columbia in 1978. It is prepared and narrated by Radio-Canada International's Susan Lumsden, who attended the controversial sessions on that elusive Pacific Coast creature known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot.
When the arguments for and against the existence of the huge, hairy, ape-like creature were exhausted, conference goers wondered openly if some of the problem was not due to methods of thinking and analysis, in short, prejudice. Perhaps Sasquatch research was being hindered by the way people think about the alleged animal, or refuse to think about it. One person, seemingly independent from the armed camps of Sasquatch hunters on one hand and the doubting academics on the other, was Dr. Ronald Westrum of East Michigan University. Dr. Westrum is a sociologist with a strong interest in psychology. He has spent considerable time studying the human background of other scientific mysteries, such as sea serpents and unidentified flying objects. Dr. Westrum told the conference that scientific mysteries, like the Sasquatch, generally go through 3 stages of evolution. The first is disbelief. The second is controversy, and the final one is acceptance, if the mystery is proved. The Sasquatch debate is obviously in stage number 2. Let's listen in now to his speech in progress. It's called Anomaly Reporting Dynamics, and this part has to do with meteorites.
And there's a very interesting question. Why is it that scientists accept an anomalous phenomenon as being real? Well, I studied UFOs and I studied sea serpents as cases where individuals would report these kind of discrepant or anomalous experiences to science, and scientists would tend not to accept them. As a kind of control case, I looked at the recognition of meteorites in the latter part of the 18th century as an example where science had found an anomaly and accepted it as real. Now, let me say a few words about the meteorite controversy to give you some background. In about 1790, there was a small village in the south of France where a lot of meteorites fell. And a local scientist heard about this and asked somebody in the village, who was a friend of his, to send him a document about these stones and some of the stones. Well, he was quite shocked when a sample of the stones arrived with a formal legal process signed by the mayor and the town attorney. And it was indicated that the whole town probably would have signed the protocol if they had been asked to. Well, this, however, did not convince the scientist that these stones had really fallen. And he said the following. Now, unfortunately, I've forgotten my paper with a quote in it, but I'll give you a synopsis of this. And he said, it's one thing to have an individual come up with a strange experience. When a whole community signs a legal protocol about an absolutely wrong fact, alleging something which is physically underlined, impossible, the only sentiment the scientist can have is one of sorrow, pity, and sympathy. Now, this wasn't the nastiest thing that was said, but this is fairly nasty. It wasn't, however, atypical. And scientists had very good explanations for how these poor, simple peasants could make a mistake about the stones which these peasants foolishly, in their superstition, alleged to have fallen from the sky. What changed scientists' minds? Well, first of all, it's commonly assumed that in science, an experiment is what proves a theory. Actually, it frequently works the other way around. And in this case, for instance, one of the things that changed scientists' mind was that they came up with a theory explaining how it was possible for the stones to fall. Now, ironically, the theory they came up with, that stones came out of lunar volcanoes, is wrong. But they had a theory. They could explain how it could have happened. And in fact, scientists said at the time, well, it's one thing if this stuff is just alleged to happen. It's another thing if we can explain how it might happen. Okay, so number one is they had to have a theory about how this stuff could take place. Okay, number two, they had to have some sort of criterion from telling the true meteorites from the false ones. Now, this took a little bit of research, because the way you learn about meteorites is by studying them. And you have to study meteorites if you're going to find out what's really characteristic of them. Well, there are actually two common kinds of meteorites, stone meteorites and iron meteorites. And they found that the stone meteorites had virtually all the same appearance and very similar composition. They had a black crust, they were grainy inside, they had little flecks of pyrite, and so on and so forth. They found, furthermore, when they looked at the iron ones, that they had nickel in them. Well, iron and nickel occur very rarely together in nature, and the fact that this seemed to occur only in these stones which fell from the sky indicated that there was some common element. And furthermore, all these stones were alleged to have fallen, so they felt that here was the criterion. Here's how you could tell the true meteorites from the non-true meteorites. There's another thing involved here, too. This process of analysis was something that common people couldn't do. Scientists could do it. And this meant that scientists were the ones to determine now what was real and what was not real. Okay, very important point. Okay, now the third thing, and this occurred in 1803, was a fall which they simply couldn't ignore. In a town called L'Aigle, which is 75 miles from Paris, something like 3,000 stones fell in an ellipse. Nice big ellipse, several miles wide, several miles long. And the French Academy sent out a scientist who, by the way, already believed that meteorites fell to examine this. And he came back with a not very surprising report that sure enough there really had been something that happened in this small village, and that 3,000 stones, his estimate, had probably fallen. And after this there really wasn't much dispute, except for a few stragglers like Thomas Jefferson. In 1807, Benjamin Silliman and David Kingsley of Yale University reported a meteorite fall, and Jefferson said about this that he would rather believe that these two Yankee professors could be lying than he could believe that stones would fall from the sky. Okay, now, why such stringent conditions? And by the way, I don't think they're any different today than they were in the 18th century, although some of you may have some dispute with me on that point. Okay, basically the reason that conditions for the acceptance of anomalies tend to be so stringent is that science has to have a certain amount of self-control. Science, the history of science, is sown with the struggle for the internal control of science by scientists and the protection of science from lay people. The history of science in this respect is well typified by the early slogan of the Royal Society, which was nullius in verba, nothing by word of mouth. Okay? Now, what this meant was that the scientist should see for himself. He should go out, make the experiment, make the observation, and not listen to what other people told him. Well, this is rather unfortunate for social intelligence, because what this means is that social intelligence is an inherently inferior form of knowledge compared to personal experiment.
Later on, in an interview, Dr. Ronald Westrum elaborated on this apparent weakness in the scientific method as far as the Sasquatch controversy is concerned.
Now, one of the things that I tried to point out was something about the limitations of science. Science is not a panacea. It can't do everything. There's only certain things it can do. And I think one of the things that one has to appreciate in considering why scientists react to Sasquatch the way they do is to consider that science is a process which necessarily has a somewhat conservative cast. That is to say that the scientist can't sort of jump onto every bandwagon. He has to pick very carefully which bandwagon he's going to jump onto, because if he jumps onto the wrong one, his career may be in shambles. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's evident that many of the scientists here are extremely skeptical of Sasquatch, and I think That's a very defensible point of view. From their point of view, there simply isn't enough physical evidence. The kind of thing they'd like to see, a Sasquatch skeleton, even better, a live Sasquatch, is simply not available. For other scientists, it seems that what's really important is the consistency of the evidence. They don't have to have something quite as hard. They simply want evidence that seems to make sense. If the report of eyewitnesses, if the footprints, if the movie that they showed the other night by Patterson seem to make sense when you take them all together, that's something very important. And that is one of the things that has impressed a lot of these sort of pro-Sasquatch scientists.
The film?
Yes, the Patterson film. But also the fact that the evidence hangs together. It seems to make sense in terms of itself. It has a kind of internal consistency, and I think that's an important point.
What do you think of the idea just presented that Sasquatch so far have avoided capture because they might have a higher sort of sensory perception that gives them this marvelous avoidance mechanism, or has somehow kept them avoiding human hunters?
Well, I'm not certain whether the basic facts on which this presumption of higher sensory development are really correct. One of the Sasquatch hunters indicated to me, for instance, that it's very, very unusual to see mountain lions, even though you know there are a lot of them around. And this may indicate simply that Sasquatch is a lot better at smelling us, seeing us, or hearing us than we are at smelling, seeing, or hearing it. One person mentioned, which I think is very interesting, that he's sensitive to smoke, and it may be that Sasquatches can smell a cigarette over a couple miles. So if you've got a Sasquatch hunter who smokes, he may be very, very easy at giving himself away to the animals he's supposed to be tracking.
That would be more given, perhaps, to believing than those to non-believing. Could you tell me in detail some of your studies with other suspected phenomena, scientific phenomena, like sea serpents, as you were talking about, unidentified flying objects, and the type and the particular scientific approaches to them on the part of scientists?
Well, when I first started this, I thought there was two sorts of personalities in science, a sort of dogmatic type on one hand, who would always turn out to be real conservative, uptight sorts, and on the other hand, there would be a sort of open-minded, liberal scientist. Actually, it doesn't work out this way at all. What you frequently find is that a scientist who gets interested in sea serpents or flying saucers or Sasquatches or whatever is, in fact, often quite a conservative person personally. The difference is that something in the person's background or something, particularly in their personal experience, has sort of clued them into this. In one case, for instance, J. Allen Hynek, who was sort of the UFO advocate, was hired by the government to investigate UFOs. Well, for many, many years, Hynek was violently, or not violently, but very, very skeptical. And finally, as a result of some things that happened to him, Hynek became convinced that UFOs were really there. But it wasn't in his personality, and I think it's a mistake to see in the personality of scientists who are pro-Sasquatch a certain sort of liberalness or anything else. They're not necessarily open-minded people, but they are very courageous people. The kinds of things that are likely to make people jump onto the Sasquatch band, it really isn't the bandwagon in science yet, but who sort of are going to be a pioneer in this respect, are people who, for some reason, want to make a personal commitment, and they're taking a very long shot, a shot that may not pay off in the time that they are having a career, and if it doesn't, they're cooked. The scientists who are anti-Sasquatch may be very liberal personally, but on Sasquatch, they're playing it safe. And the reason they're playing it safe is because there is nothing that has personally happened to them to make them jump, to get them to stick their necks out. And that's very reasonable, because if somebody doesn't produce a Sasquatch, somebody like, for instance, Grover Krantz, who is very impressed by Sasquatch footprints, is not going to look very good to his colleagues in a few years. So it's a question of making a bet. And I don't think people realize that. Scientists have to make bets, and on the outcome of that bet is determined the person's career.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned religion a moment or so ago, and what I've noticed on the part of the amateur Sasquatch hunters here, the people probably without degrees, is this particular almost religious fervor.
I think from a sociologist's point of view, the thing that strikes one is that the person with a sort of deviant or unusual belief is likely to separate people into two categories, those who are his friends and those who are not his friends. It's very difficult to keep an open mind and be sort of even-handed. What this means is that there has to be some sort of protective armor on the part of the person to deal with the fact that most people in society may think this person is crazy. And part of this protective armor is what appears to the layman, I hope you pardon my saying so, as a kind of religious belief in Sasquatch. What this is, essentially, is a kind of defensive mechanism to allow the person to continue in what is certainly a deviant line of belief. And without this ability to sort of stick it out in the face of overwhelming, sometimes, public and scientific opposition, this belief that one is right, often seemingly in the face of impossible odds, is often essentially a kind of religious feeling. I don't know if religious is quite the right word, because people don't worship Sasquatch. And they often do seem to have rather closed minds. But this is, as I suggest, a kind of defensive device to protect them.
I'm wondering if this has happened in the past, in controversies, scientific controversies surrounding other things, like do you think there was a type of debate going on like this prior to or during the debate about whether the world indeed was flat or round, or revolving around Darwin's theory of evolution?
Okay, well, if you take the meteorite case, which is what I spent quite a bit of time doing, in the meteorite case, the lines were very strongly drawn, and the few scientists who early on believed that there really was something to meteorites were often very viciously attacked by their professional colleagues. One anti-meteorite scientist, for instance, said that even if one fell at his feet, he could say, well, I saw it, but I don't believe in it. So frequently, you often find a kind of religious dogmatism, not only on the part of the anomaly advocate, but also on the part of the anomaly detractor. There is not unusually in science some sort of statement to the effect that, well, I haven't read this person's book, but I'm sure it's full of nonsense. Now, this is not a scientific attitude, but this is an attitude that one does find in science frequently in the face of possible new information and discoveries. There are many scientists who, previous to the fact of discovery, simply say, if what this person believes is really correct, then everything we know is wrong. Let me give you another example. The fellow who discovered that continents may slide, we call it plate tectonics, a fellow named Wegener. I read a paper that was written at a symposium years and years ago about Wegener, and a fellow stood up and he said, if what Wegener believes about plate tectonics is really correct, then everything we know about this, everything we've learned in geology so far, will have to be thrown out the window. Well, this is simply incorrect. But this is the kind of statement that people make, and this is, again, a kind of protective device, a device to protect science from what are viewed as a sort of ravagers of the camp, the people who are going to come in and mess things up. And frequently, the scientist who's a pioneer and so on is looked upon as a kind of dangerous person, precisely because he's going to sort of shake things up.
What has impressed you most about the debate here at this conference? I mean, have you learned anything? You've studied this so thoroughly in other examples, but have you learned anything new from the events here?
Well, the conclusions aren't all in yet. I'm still I'm doing some interviewing myself of some of the scientists here. I guess one of the things that impresses me very much is the degree to which there's been a lot of information flow from one person to another about who's a reliable Sasquatch researcher and who's not. I have learned an enormous amount through essentially gossip about some of the Sasquatch researchers. It's one thing to read a man's book. It's another thing to talk to people who've been out in the field with him and who make judgments or evaluations about whether this person's a credible person or not. My opinion of many Sasquatch researchers has changed, in some cases for the better, in some cases for the worse, as a result of the personal contacts that I've made here. And I think this is one of the functions of this conference. In fact, another really important thing that I'm rather pleased by is the contact between the Sasquatch researchers, who frequently don't even have college degrees, and the scientists who do things like analyzing Sasquatch droppings and hair and footprints and so on. I think some very valuable research contacts have been made by the people who are good at making laboratory analyses on one hand, and the people who actually have to go out and gather the specimens on the other. I'm rather pleased by that.
And how do you think the hunt for the Sasquatch is going to evolve, or what direction will it take as a result of this particular meeting?
Well, actually, I don't think there's any particular direction it will necessarily take. I think probably the specimens of various kinds of physical traces that people get will probably be more likely to end up in the hands of laboratory technicians. I think actually if we do make a big jump in progress in Sasquatch research, it's going to be almost entirely by accident. Somebody will be out in the brush and they'll just happen to be there with the camera at the right time, as in the Patterson film, for instance. Or some hunter will just be real quick on the trigger and shoot a Sasquatch and lop off its head and come running in with it and say, well, look what I found. It's going to be some sort of accident, I think, which is really going to make the difference. Because the slow accumulation of facts is going to do something, but the really spectacular discovery, I think, is going to come almost entirely by accident. But it may be as a result of the kind of effort that people are putting into Sasquatch research, which, of course, is helped by a conference like this.
And now Dr. Ronald Westrum returns to the lectern to conclude the
program.
program.
Of controversy, you have another problem, and that is what I call the low threshold anomaly experience. In this case, the individual has a kind of cognitive set in favor of perceiving the anomaly, and it doesn't take much to trigger the reaction, oh gosh, that was the Sasquatch, or did you see the UFO that was up there? It only takes a few cues, and these cues are widely circulated in society. At this point, for instance, I think one of the real problems that Sasquatch hunters and researchers have is that there are a large number of individuals who have a sort of very low threshold for seeing Sasquatches, and will do it at the drop of a hat. And this is a serious problem. UFO research is bedeviled by this kind of problem. In fact, it's much worse than Sasquatch things. I have tried to explain to people that the airplane lights that they were seeing, or the star Arcturus, the planet Jupiter, and various other objects, including a porch light. By the way, we thought it was a porch light, so we called the person up and asked them to turn it on and off, and sure enough, the UFO blinked. This, by the way, did not persuade the witness that it was not a porch light. And this low threshold sighting business is really quite serious. Now, there are, by the way, a number of perceptual criteria, this is something, by the way, I've tried to work on, which you can use as a kind of elementary sieve to sift out some of the genuine anomaly experiences. One of the things that we find, for instance, is that when you've got a genuine anomaly experience and people aren't actually out looking for something, is that you have what J. Allen Hynek calls the escalation of hypotheses. And that is that the individual starts out by seeing the anomalous object as something fairly routine. In the case of a Sasquatch, it might be a bear, a person, or something else. The individual then gradually moves toward a more exotic hypothesis to fit the experience that the individual is seeing. And one of the things that you will find in the genuine anomaly experience in many cases is that the individual really had trouble seeing the thing as an anomaly in the first place. He or she was not cognitively ready to perceive the thing as an anomaly. And the person first saw it as something else. In a UFO case I investigated, for instance, the person described stepping out in his driveway and looking up into the air at what seemed to him to be an airliner. But then he noticed that the airliner wasn't moving very fast, in fact, much too slow for an airliner, in spite of this line of lighted windows. Okay, so then he thought it might be a helicopter. Only problem, no noise. Okay, so then he looked at it again, and this time he saw what seemed to him to be a large disc, about 800 feet up, which silently went slowly away to the northwest. Now, I don't want to argue, because the sighting was very short, that this person actually did see a UFO or an interplanetary spacecraft. What I would like to emphasize is that this experience to me is more credible than one where the individual said, gosh, I just saw this spaceship. Because in this case, there isn't any escalation of hypotheses. Now, another thing we find is that when you have a genuinely anomalous experience, one that the individual feels that he or she is not supposed to be having, they tend to make some kind of critical check, a perceptual check on their own experience. They'll change position, they'll call other people to come and look, they'll look for physical traces in some cases to validate that they've actually seen what they thought they saw, and they'll behave as if they're in doubt about their own perceptual experiences. And this is perfectly normal given the fact that the individual has just seen something which they are not supposed to see, which isn't supposed to happen. And so it's logical that they should make some checks on their own experiences. Now, when people don't make checks, when they aren't critical about their experiences, then you're in a very bad situation, at least from a research point of view, because in this case, the witness obviously had a very low threshold for perception. Now, in a case where people are actually looking for UFOs or Sasquatches or sea serpents, it's basically fruitless to look for sea serpents, by the way, because the sightings are so rare. I'm not talking about a Loch Ness monster, but actual sea serpents. The sightings are so rare that it's hardly worth it. In this case, you expect a low threshold, okay? Now, there's another thing, too, that I should mention, and that is frequently when you have a report released, the reports which are released are not necessarily current ones, they're old ones. And this is one of the things that throws people off, because all of a sudden, after somebody reports something in the press, there's a whole bunch of reports which come in, usually, in fact, frequently quite old ones. After Ivan Sanderson published an article called "Don't Scoff at Sea Monsters," he got something like 6 sea serpent reports, some of which were 20 or 30 years old. In the case of the first articles in British Columbia about Sasquatches, I think something like 30 or 40 sightings came to light within a few weeks of the publication of the articles, and I unfortunately don't have the figures here. But all of a sudden you have this mass of old sightings, and this is very interesting. Now, unfortunately, of course, in the long run, what's going to happen is that the cues which you can use to identify anomalies are going to become more widely circulated, and then you have the problem of low threshold experiences. But I want to stop here and see if I could keep talking, but I'd rather see if people have some specific questions about this anomaly reporting process.
You have been listening to Dr. Ronald Westrum of Eastern Michigan University, as he was heard speaking to the Conference on Humanoid Monsters at the University of British Columbia in 1978. Next, to kill or not to kill the Sasquatch. The moral questions surrounding the search for that elusive ape-like creature of the Pacific Northwest.